Oh yeah, we might as well read Machiavelli. Chapter 19. Okay, talk about that tomorrow. But a disclaimer, I'm just the reader of this book. I read other novels. I don't just, this is a popular book. I'm not saying to live by this. Like I said, I'm like Niccolo Machiavelli. I think he wrote this in a way that was like, if I did it, what he sees what'll work or not. It doesn't say he thinks it's right or not. He's just kind of saying the truth of what he's pondered on and what he's seen through experience of history. He seemed like to be a historian who, you know, seeing these other events happen and other moves these princes made. This guy was a person fond of people in power and the stories and the outcomes. So, chapter 19, of how to avoid contempt and hatred. As I have already discussed the most important qualities that attract praise or blame, I would like to touch on others in more general terms so that the prince may know. As I have to some extent mentioned how to avoid the things that would make him hated and scorned, if he manages to do this, he will have accomplished his duty and will not face any risk should he penetrate other infamies. What will make him hated above all, as I have said, is rapaciousness and seizing the what would make him hated above all, is, as I have said, is rapaciousness and seizing the property and women of his subjects, which he must refrain from. Men will generally live contentedly as long as their property and honor are not touched, and the prince need only counter the ambition of a few, which can be done easily and in many ways. So it says, and the prince need only counter the ambition of a few, which can be done easily and in many ways. What will make the prince contemptible is for him to be perceived as undependable, frivolous, effeminate, pusillanimous, P-U-S-I-L-L-A-N-I-M-O-U-S, and irresolute, which is like uncertain, against which a prince must guard himself as from the plague. So let's go back. So first, for a prince not to be hated, because you have power, right? Prince has this power, has this like this notification. Oh, the prince. It's like being a celebrity. This goes for people who are celebrities or just even business owners. You know, you seem successful. You're running. So even when you're amidst your peers, the people you do business with, or the people who do business for you, you know, they have wives, and vice versa. And you're seen as the higher person. And, you know, when you come across your brother who's not at the level you are, or the same level, or, you know, it's all about respect. You know, as long as you're not taking from someone's property or their woman, you know, especially as a prince with that power, not overusing that power. As well as, what will make the prince contemptible is for him to be perceived as undependable, frivolous, effeminate, pusillanimous, and irresolute, against which a prince must guard himself as from the plague. He must do this utmost so that his actions will be perceived as imbued or endowed, I-M-B-U-E-D, with greatness, courage, dignity, and power. And as for the private affairs of his subjects, he must be adamant that his decisions are irrevocable. He must maintain a standing such that no man would venture to cheat or deceive him. A prince who creates this opinion of himself will be greatly esteemed, and it is difficult to attack or conspire against one who is greatly esteemed, so long as he is perceived as excellent and is revered by his people. But a prince must have two fears, one internal, based on his subjects, the other external, based on foreign powers. From the foreign enemy, the prince can defend himself with good arms and good friends, and he who has good arms will always have good friends, and internal matters will always be stable when external matters are stable, so long as they have not been clouded by conspiracy. But even if external matters are volatile, the prince will always counter every violence if he has lived and ruled, as I have mentioned, and does not lose courage, as I have said Nabis of Sparta did. When external affairs are stable, the prince must still fear that his subjects might conspire secretly against him, but he will be quite safe from this as long as he avoids being hated or despised and keeps the populace on his side. It is important that he do this, as I have said at length above. One of the strong remedies a prince has against conspiracy is not to be hated by the masses, because conspirators are invariably certain that they will satisfy the populace by killing the prince. But if, on the other hand, they think they will enrage the populace They will not pluck up the courage for such an act because the difficulties facing conspirators are infinite. Experience has taught that there have been many conspiracies, but few that have ended well, because whoever conspires cannot do so alone, nor can he attract cohorts other than those who he believes are malcontents. Oh, like not content. And the moment you take a malcontent into your confidence, you give him the opportunity to become quite content, pursuing his own advantage by betraying you. So much so that seeing the certain gain in that direction and seeing doubt and peril in the other, it must be a rare friend or a most determined enemy of the prince who will keep his word to you. In short, from the conspirator's point of view, there is nothing but fear, rivalry, and the prospect of horrific punishment. Whereas from the prince's perspective, there are the majesty of the principality, the laws and the protection afforded by friends in the state. If one also adds the goodwill of the people, it is unlikely that anyone would be so bold as to conspire against the prince, since under normal circumstances, conspirators have much to fear before committing the evil deed. But in this case, they have just as much to fear afterward as they will have the whole populace against them. Once their deed is done, they cannot hope for the refuge anywhere. I could cite infinite examples of this, but shall limit myself to one incident that took place within the memory of our fathers. Annibale Bentivoglio, the Prince of Bologna and grandfather of the present Annibale Bentivoglio, was killed by the Canesci, who conspired against him, leaving no one to succeed him except his son Giovanni. At that time, still in swaddling clothes, immediately after the murder, the people rose and killed all the Canesci, a result of the people's goodwill toward the house of Bentivoglio. In all Bologna, after Annibale's death, there were no heirs who could rule the state, but the people's goodwill was so great that when they heard that there was a Bentivoglio living in Florence, who had been thought to be the son of a blacksmith, they went there to offer him the government of Bologna, which he accepted until young Giovanni Bentiglovo came of age. I therefore conclude that a prince need not worry unduly about conspiracies when the people are well disposed toward him. But if they are enemies and hate him, he must fear everything and everybody. Well-ordered states and wise princes have been careful not to anger the nobles and to keep the populace content, because this is one of the most important tasks that falls on a prince. Among the well-ordered and well-governed states of our times in France, it has countless good institutions on which the king's liberty and security depend, of which the foremost is the parliament and its authority. For he who set up this system was aware of the nobles' insolence and ambition and deemed that they needed a harness to keep them in check, but he was also aware of the people's hatred of the nobles, a hatred based on fear. The idea was to assuage, A-S-S-U-A-G-E, both factions, but without the king's being seen to be involved. This removed any allegations the nobles might make that the king was favoring the populace, or any allegations the populace might make that he was favoring the nobles. This was the reason for establishing an independent institution that could keep the nobles in check and favor the people without compromising the king. Such a decision could not have been better or more wise, nor could there be a better guarantee for the security of the king and the kingdom, from which one can draw another notable principle. Princes must delegate difficult tasks to others and keep popular ones for themselves. So princes must delegate difficult tasks to others and keep popular ones for themselves. Once more, I conclude that a prince has to respect the nobles, but must not make himself hated by the populace. Many who have considered the way that certain Roman emperors lived and died might argue that they present examples that contradict my opinions, as some of these emperors did live excellently, showing much skill and spirit, but nevertheless lost their throne or were killed by their own men who conspired against them. I will respond to these objections by discussing the qualities of a few emperors, demonstrating that the reasons for their ruin are in accord with what I have cited. This should be of interest to anyone reading about the events of that era. I will limit myself to the emperors who came to the throne between the reigns of Marcus the philosopher and Maximinus. These were Marcus, his son Commodus, Pertinax, Julianus, Severus, his son Antoninus, Caracalla, that's his son Antoninus Caracalla, that's his last name, Caracalla, Macrinus, Elagabalus, Alexander, and Maximinus. First of all, I would like to point out that while in most principalities one merely has to contend with the ambitions of the great and the hostility of the populace, The Roman emperors had to face a third problem. This is a long chapter, bro. I got like another 20 minutes. This guy's a historian. Had to face a third problem, contending with the cruelty and plundering of their soldiers. This was so difficult that it proved the ruin of many, since it was hard to satisfy both army and populace. The populace wants peace and hence a modest prince, while the army wants a prince with a military spirit who is arrogant, cruel, and rapacious, and ready to unleash these qualities on the populace so that the soldiers can double their pay and give free rein to their greed and cruelty. The result was that those emperors who by nature or education did not have the standing that could keep the army or the populace in check invariably came to grief. Most of these emperors, particularly those who came to power as new princes, knew the difficulty of balancing these two opposing factions and chose to reward the soldiers with little thought of how this would harm the populace. This was a necessary decision. A prince cannot avoid being hated by one of the two factions, hence he must first strive not to be hated by the people. And should that not be possible, he should do his utmost to avoid the hatred of the faction that is more powerful. Therefore, emperors who were new princes and especially needed strong backing preferred to side with the army rather than the populace. This proved to be the emperor's benefit or not, depending on whether he knew how to maintain his standing with the army. It was for these reasons that Marcus, Pertinax, and Alexander, modest men who loved justice, spurned cruelty, and were kind and humane, met tragic ends. All that is, except for Marcus, who lived and died with honor. He had come to the imperial throne by inheritance and did not need to show gratitude to the army or the populace, and he was a man of great skill, which made him venerated by all. Throughout his life, he kept the soldiers in check and the people within bounds, and was never hated or disdained. But Pertinax was made emperor despite the opposition of the soldiers, who had been used to living licentiously under Commodus and could not bear the honest way of life that Pertinax wanted to force on them. Pertinax inspired hatred, and as he was an old man, contempt as well, so he came to ruin at the very start of his reign. And here one must note that hatred can be caused through good deeds as much as through bad. As I have said before, a prince who wants to maintain his state is often forced not to be good, because when the faction that you believe you need in order to rule is corrupt, whether it is the populace, the army, or the nobles, it is to your advantage to satisfy them, in which case good deeds are your enemy. But let us come to Emperor Alexander, who was so good that among the many things he was praised for was that not a single man was put to death without trial during his 14-year reign. Nevertheless, he was considered effeminate and a man who let himself be governed by his mother. This brought derision upon him, and the army conspired against him and killed him. Let us now discuss and contrast the qualities of Commodus, Severus, Antoninus, Caracalla, and Maximus, all of whom you will find most cruel and rapacious. To satisfy their soldiers, they did not spare any violence that could be inflicted on the populace. All these emperors, with the exception of Severus, came to a bad end. Severus was so skilled that he managed to keep the army on his side even though he oppressed the populace, and so had a successful reign. His skill made him so formidable in the eyes of the army and the populace that the former remained satisfied and reverent, and the latter awestruck and stupefied. Remember, I'm just reading this. It's hard to remember everything. I wonder how long. For a new prince, Severus' actions were great and noteworthy, and so I would like to briefly demonstrate how well he used the traits of both the fox and the lion, which I have already referred to as necessary for a prince to emulate. When Severus was general of the Roman army in Slavonia, he was aware of the indolence of Emperor Julianus, and he persuaded his men to follow him to Rome to avenge the death of Pertinax, who had died at the hands of the Praetorian Guard. Under this pretext, Severus marched his army against Rome without revealing that he had any aspirations to the imperial throne, and was in Italy before anyone ever realized that he had set out. When he arrived in Rome, the Senate elected him emperor out of fear and sentenced Julianus to death. Severus now faced two difficulties in asserting his authority over the whole empire. One was Asia, where Niger, general of the Asiatic armies, had had himself proclaimed emperor, and the other was the West, where Albinus was aspiring to the throne. Severus deemed it dangerous to declare himself an enemy to both men, and so decided to attack Niger and deceive Albinus. He wrote to Albinus that although the Senate had elected him Severus emperor, he wanted to share the throne with Albinus and was sending him to the title of Caesar. He informed him that through a pronouncement of the Senate he had made him his co-ruler. All of this Albinus believed, but no sooner had Severus defeated and killed Niger, bringing Asia under his control, than he returned to Rome and denounced Albinus in the Senate, charging that Albinus was plotting to kill him instead of showing gratitude for the favors he had been accorded. Severus announced that he was compelled to punish Albinus's ingratitude. He confronted him in France and took from him his state and his life. Whoever considers Severus' actions will see that he was a ferocious lion and a cunning fox, feared and revered by all and not hated by the army. One should not be surprised that as a new prince he managed to secure so much authority, for his exceptional standing always shielded him from the hatred that his rapaciousness might have sparked among the people. Okay, Severus' son Antoninus was also a man with qualities that made him formidable in the eyes of the people and popular with his soldiers. He was a military man who could bear any hardship and who scorned delicate dishes and every other weakness. This raised in him the esteem of his soldiers. Nevertheless, Antoninus' ferocity and cruelty were so great and so unprecedented. After untold murders, he had a large part of the population of Rome and the entire populace of Alexandria put to death, that all the world came to despise him. Antoninus was feared even by his own entourage, which resulted in his being killed by a centurion in the midst of his own army, from which it is to be noted that a prince cannot avoid assassination resulting from the deliberations of a determined mind, because he can be assaulted by anyone who does not care about dying himself. A prince need not fear this unduly, because such men are very rare. He has only to refrain from inflicting grave injury on those who serve him and who he keeps about him. Noted that the principality of the... Did I skip a page? Okay, so similarly... Oh no, I did skip a page. Yeah, he has only to refrain from inflicting grave injury on those who serve him and whom he keeps about himself in service of the state. Antoninus did inflict such injury shamefully, killing the brother of one of his own centurions and threatening the centurion every day, even though he retained him as his bodyguard. Such rash conduct was bound to bring about his own ruin, and it did. But let us come to Commodus, who, having inherited his throne from his father, Emperor Marcus, should have been able to hold on to it with ease. He had only to follow in his father's footsteps to satisfy both the army and the people, but he had a cruel and feral nature. In order to exercise his rapacity on the populace, he chose to favor the army and allowed it every dissipation. Furthermore, he did not maintain his dignity, often descending into the arenas to fight with gladiators and doing other things that were contemptible and unworthy of imperial majesty, becoming a figure of scorn in the eyes of the soldiers, being hated on one hand and scorned on the other. He was conspired against and killed. It remains for us to consider the qualities of Maximinus, who was extremely pugnacious, but as the army had become weary of Alexander's weakness, which I discussed above, when he died, they elected Maximinus to the imperial throne, but Maximinus did not rule for long. Two things made him hated and disdained. First, he came from a very humble background, having herded sheep in Thrace, Thrace, it's a place, a fact that was widely known and looked down upon by all. And second, at the beginning of his reign, he resisted going to Rome to take possession of the imperial throne. So I guess Rome was like, oh, the throne was. He also gave the impression of being unusually cruel, since through his prefects he had exercised great brutality in Rome and throughout the empire. As a result, everyone was filled with contempt for his lowly birth and with hatred that arose from fear of his ferocity. First Africa rebelled, then the Senate and the populace of Rome. And finally all of Italy conspired against him. His own soldiers rebelled during a difficult siege of Aquileia, Aquileia, and tired of his cruelty and fearing him less because he had so many enemies, they killed him. I will not discuss Elagabalus, Macrinus, or Julianus. Those are three different people who were so widely disdained that they were quickly eliminated, but shall come to the conclusion of this discourse. The princes of our era do not face the Roman emperor's problem of having to indulge the soldiers by unlawful means, though they do have to make some concessions to them. Issues are now resolved quickly, as none of our princes have the kind of established armies that evolved with the government and with the administration of the provinces, as was the case in imperial Rome. If in Roman times it was necessary to favor the army more than the people, that was because the soldiers carried more weight than the people. Now it is necessary for all princes, except the Ottoman Sultan and the Sultan of Egypt, to favor the people above the army, because it is the people who carry more weight. But I make an exception of the Ottoman Sultan. He always surrounds himself with an infantry of 12,000 and a cavalry of 15,000, on which the security and the power of his rule depend. For him it is vital that he set aside all their considerations and keep his soldiers well disposed. Similarly, the Egyptian Sultan's rule is also entirely in the hands of his soldiers, and so it behooves him to keep them on his side without consideration for the populace. What's a sultan? Okay, it should be noted that the principality of the Egyptian Sultan differs from other principalities in that it is similar to the Christian pontificate. pontificate, which cannot be called a hereditary principality or a new principality, because it is not the sons of the old prince who are the heirs and rulers. Princes are elected to that rank by those who have made the authority to do so. As the Egyptian sultanate is an old institution, one cannot call it a new principality, because it does not bring with it any of the difficulties of the new principalities. Even if the prince is new, the institutions of that state are old and set up to receive him as if they were a hereditary ruler. But let us return to our subject. If one weighs the above discourse, it is clear that it was hatred or contempt that brought about the ruin of the emperors I have mentioned. Though some followed one path and some the other, in each case some of the emperors ended well and some badly. It was futile and disastrous for Pertinax and Alexander as new princes to imitate Marcus, who was a hereditary ruler, and it was just as disastrous for Caracalla, Commodus, and Maximus, three different people, Caracalla, Commodus, and Maximus, to imitate Severus, as they did not have the skill to follow in his footsteps. A new prince in a new principality cannot imitate the exploits of Marcus, but neither should he imitate those of Severus. He must take from Severus the necessary attributes to found a new state, and from Marcus the glorious attributes suitable for conserving a state that is already established and stable. So he must take from Severus the necessary attributes to found a new state, and from Marcus the glorious attributes suitable for serving a state that is already established and stable.